Kudeta militer yang terjadi pada Februari 2021 kian menambah daftar panjang kasus kekerasan dan pelanggaran hak asasi manusia di Myanmar. Desakan untuk memberikan tindakan tegas oleh ASEAN sebagai salah satu organisasi regional di Asia kian mengemuka. Lantas bagaimanakah konflik ini memberikan pengaruh terhadap ASEAN Chairmanship Indonesia di tahun 2023? Dan seperti apa Indonesia bisa berperan untuk mengatasi konflik yang syarat dengan kekerasan ini? Saya akan membahasnya dengan Dr. Markus Brand, Ketua Komisi International IDEA di Myanmar. Let's start first to talk about the Myanmar situation. Can you please explain to us what is the latest update?
Well, the news from Myanmar is unfortunately very depressing and not positive at all. Essentially, in the last 1.5 years, the military that took power unconstitutionally on the 1st of February last year has been trying to establish stability and a normal order of governance around the country, but that has not succeeded. Mostly because the people, including their elected representatives, have refused to accept the takeover of power by the military and have mounted an unprecedented resistance movement that draws power from all segments of society, in rural areas, in urban areas, across ethnic and religious groups. And people are very clearly saying they do not want military power and they do not accept the military's framing of events, which includes cancelling the elections of 2020 and the elimination of any opposition from the democratic forces.
Okay, how about the connection between Myanmar and ASEAN? Because Indonesia is going to take the ASEAN chairmanship for next year. Will Myanmar conflict influence Indonesia's Asian chairmanship?
Yes, so this is the reason why I just visited Jakarta and had consultations with counterparts in the government and civil society, because it is quite clear that the challenge of Myanmar will be one of the priority questions for the Indonesian chairmanship next year, just as it has been for the outgoing Cambodian chairmanship, as well as the chairmanship last year. The situation is that the unconstitutionality of the coup in Naypyidaw raises the question of who represents the member state, Myanmar, and who is entitled to participate in meetings. And since the military chief has not been recognized as the new head of state, as the legitimate head of government, they are excluded from summit meetings and from senior level meetings. But that raises, of course, the question of what kind of relations ASEAN has with one of its member states, as well as on the bilateral level. And moving towards a peaceful resolution of this crisis was something that ASEAN has been demanding from day one. Now the question is, of course, how ASEAN will react to the next scheme designed by the military de facto authorities in Naypyidaw, which is to organize a sham election during next year, which would be aimed to be a PR exercise to legitimize military rule, because it would exclude all the opposition parties and it would exclude all meaningful alternative voices to the military viewpoint of things. Well, it is hard to be certain, but the latest UN figures are that an additional 1 million people have been displaced internally since the coup. There was already a considerable number of internally displaced persons before the coup, because of course the country has not been at peace for decades, actually, and there have been conflicts going on, and then there was the genocidal action against the Rohingya population in the last few years that has contributed a lot to the suffering and to the displacement. So since the coup alone, a civil society organization documenting victims has counted almost 2,500 who were either murdered in the streets by the security forces or tortured to death in prisons. And many more have fallen victim to the actions by military in the periphery of the country.
What is the biggest barrier to uphold the democracy in Myanmar?
Well, to put it simply, the biggest barrier is the military itself, which has over decades gotten used to being in a situation where it sees itself as a state within the state, or rather above the state, and an entity that can operate above the law and that can use the law to control the rest of society.
Okay, then what is the best approach to resolve the conflict?
Well, it is, of course, necessary, and in particular for diplomatic offices and international organizations that still operate within Myanmar, to keep channels open to the military regime in Naypyidaw. But I think the risk is to provide legitimacy and to provide recognition to the military in this way, which could make the military believe that it actually was able to get away with what it did. And here it is very important for fellow ASEAN countries to not betray the population, the people of Myanmar, and to really listen to what the people of Myanmar want to do and how they want to live, because ultimately ASEAN is a community of nations, of people, and not of governments. And it is the responsibility of the ASEAN community to take into account the wish of the people on how they want to be ruled and governed, because denying them that right will lead to permanent conflict and instability.
In what part Indonesia can participate to resolve the conflict in Myanmar?
Well, I think it is very important to deny legitimacy and recognition to the military regime and to not buy into any of the PR exercises that are planned by the military in the form of holding an election exercise. That election will not be legitimate and will not be credible and should not be recognized by Indonesia or anybody else in the international community. So I think ASEAN and Indonesia in particular is well placed to play a constructive role. I think Indonesia's weight as a large democracy, as a responsible global citizen will be heard. I think the rest of the international community is willing to follow the lead of ASEAN and in particular of Indonesia. So that is also why the expectations of Indonesia for the chairmanship next year are very high.
Thank you so much, Dr. Markus Brand, for talking to CNN Indonesia. Looking forward to seeing you in person in Indonesia, and we will talk more regarding this issue.
It will be my pleasure.